The snow started at dawn, a quiet dusting of white that promised nothing. But by mid-morning, it was a monster, a full-blown storm that swallowed the line between the ground and the sky, turning the world into a howling, white void. The wind was a knife, sharp and bitter, and it carried the snow sideways. Yet through this blizzard, a man was walking. He was shirtless. His broad shoulders were steaming in the frozen air, the heat of his own body fighting back against the storm. His hair was as white as the snow itself, long and wild, whipping across a face that was a roadmap of old scars. To the few who saw him from a distance, he didn't look like a man at all. He looked like a phantom, a giant Apache ghost, wandering the empty wilderness, completely alone. He wasn't in a hurry. Each step was heavy, deliberate, as if he were carrying the weight of 100 winters on his back. And when he spoke, his words were stolen by the gale, lost to anyone but himself. "We are too old for love." Down in the valley, the town was a collection of dark shapes huddled under sagging roofs of snow. There, a woman was gathering firewood, her hands stiff and numb inside her thin gloves. Her name was Isabella, and though she was only 40, her hair was streaked with the same silver white as the man's on the mountain. It slipped from her bonnet, clinging to her cold cheeks in icy strands. She used to be proud of that hair. When the first white strands appeared years ago, she thought they made her look graceful, distinguished. The town, however, had other words for her: ghost widow, cursed, barren witch. The whispers followed her everywhere, a second shadow she could never shake. Today was no different. As she bent to pick up a fallen branch, she heard it, the sound of children giggling behind a fence. The poison of their whispered words reached her ears. She straightened up fast, her cheeks burning hot with shame. It was the old familiar ache, the pain of being looked at but never truly seen. Winter was a cruel season on its own. It didn't need the town's help. Her small wagon was parked at the edge of the frozen path, piled high with logs she'd spent the morning splitting. But when she tried to pull it forward, there was a sharp, ugly crack. The right wheel, swollen and brittle from the ice, had split. The whole cart sank into a deep snowdrift, stuck fast. Isabella pushed. She strained until her worn gloves tore, until her breath came out in ragged, smoky rasps. But the wheel wouldn't budge. It was buried. She finally gave up, pressing her forehead against the cold, rough wood of the wagon, letting the sting of the wind and snow bite at her face. It was such a small thing, really, just a broken wheel. But lately it was the small things that broke her. Loneliness had a way of making every single burden feel twice as heavy. That's when she heard it, the crunch of heavy boots in the snow behind her. She looked up and her breath caught in her throat. It was him, the giant Apache from the hills. He stood right in front of her, his chest completely bare to the raging storm, his muscles etched with scars that told stories of 1,000 old battles. His white hair fell to his shoulders like a crown made of frost. For a second, she thought the mountain itself had come alive and stepped down to see her. She was afraid. Of course she was. Every story she'd ever heard about him painted him as a savage, a cursed man, untamed and dangerous. But then she saw his eyes. They were dark, downcast, and in them she saw a deep, profound shame that struck her harder than any fear. He didn't say a word. He just crouched down, placing his enormous, scarred hands under the wagon's axle. With one slow, powerful heave, he lifted the entire thing clear of the snow. His muscles strained, the old scars pulling tight across his skin. His breath came out in huge clouds of steam. The wheel came free. He set the wagon down as gently as if he were placing a sleeping child in its crib. Isabella opened her mouth to thank him, but the words wouldn't come out. Not when she saw the way he turned his face away from her, as if he wasn't worthy of even a glance. The storm howled in the silence between them. She finally found her voice, though it was trembling. I, I would have been stranded." He still didn't answer. He just took a step back, the snow clinging to the hard lines of his chest. His eyes were shadowed by the curtain of his white hair. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the wheel he had just freed, as if he were ashamed of the simple act of kindness. Then, with his shoulders hunched, he turned and started walking away, back into the heart of the storm. The snow swallowed him almost immediately, his massive form disappearing behind curtains of swirling white. Isabella just stood there, her hands pressed against the side of her wagon, her breath rising in pale ribbons. She should have felt relieved. He was a dangerous man after all. That's what everyone said. But she didn't feel relief. Instead, a strange, hollow ache opened up inside her chest. It felt as if something precious, something she didn't even know she was missing, had just brushed past her and slipped away before she could grasp it. She wanted to call out to him, to ask him to wait. But the old fear of the town, of their gossip, choked the words in her throat. What would they say if they saw her, the ghost widow speaking to the mountain savage? Still, a warmth she hadn't felt in years stirred deep inside her. She climbed onto the wagon seat and gently guided the mule forward. The broken wheel rolled smoothly now. Her eyes kept searching the wall of white where he had vanished, but the storm showed no trace of him. The road ahead was lonely, winding toward the dim, blurry shapes of the town. Her fingers trembled on the reins. The sound of the children's laughter still echoed in her mind. The whispers of the women in the church pews. The sharp, dismissive words of the merchants who refused to meet her gaze. Her entire life had become a series of rejections. But in the eyes of that scarred stranger, in that deep, downcast shame, she had seen a mirror of her own. He carried his shame just like she did, silently, with a dignity that was worn thin but somehow not entirely broken. By the time she made it back to her small cabin at the edge of town, night was falling hard. The fire she lit in the hearth felt too small, too weak to chase away the memory of his presence. She stacked the logs, watching the sparks fly up the chimney like tiny fleeting stars. Her body shivered, even as the flames grew higher. Outside, the storm raged, battering the roof and moaning at the window shutters. She sat in the warm glow, her silver hair unbound, and whispered into the empty room. I've waited my whole life for something I've never known. Far away beyond the town where the hills gave way to true wilderness, the Apache walked on alone. The snow clung to his eyelashes and the cold was a gnawing thing that bit at his very bones. But he welcomed it. He believed it was his penance. His punishment for a past he could never outrun. It was his fate to feel the bite of winter, to carry his scars without the comfort of warmth or companionship. He had lived through too many winters, buried too many friends, lost too much. Once he had been a warrior, proud, feared, respected. Now he was just an aging shadow with hair that had gone white far too soon. No tribe would claim him. No family called him home. He was an echo in a world that had moved on. He thought of the woman with the silver hair and the weary, lonely eyes, and his heart stirred against his will. He clenched his fists, the scarred skin pulling tight, and muttered the same words again to the storm. We are too old for love. The night grew deeper, blacker. In her cabin, Isabella pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, the fire glowing brightly but offering little comfort. In the wilderness, he pressed onward, each heavy step a testament to his solitude. They were both awake under the same raging storm, haunted by the same deep ache. Neither of them knew that the snow, in its fury, had already begun to weave their lonely paths together. And when Isabella finally closed her eyes, she didn't see the scornful faces of the townspeople or hear the cruel laughter of the children. She saw only the white-haired giant disappearing into the snow, and she felt her heart whisper a defiant answer back into the silence. The snow didn't stop. For days it just kept coming down, pressing on the roofs of the town, muffling every sound until the world felt like it was wrapped in cotton. Every step outside was a chore, a battle against the drifts. For Isabella, the physical weight of the snow was nothing compared to the weight of the town's whispers, which never seemed to melt away. She couldn't walk down the main street without hearing a tongue cluck behind her, or seeing a woman quickly cover her mouth to hide a smirk. Her white hair, gleaming like a beacon against the dark fabric of her bonnet, marked her. She was a ghost in their midst. The town had gotten used to treating her as if she were both invisible and painfully visible at the same time. She was a curiosity, a walking, breathing reminder of everything they feared becoming. Too old, too alone, too unwanted. That morning she was trying to haul a bundle of logs up to her porch. The rope was slick with ice, and it slipped right through her numb fingers. The logs scattered, rolling away into the deep snowdrifts. She knelt down, her breath fogging in the frigid air, her fingers so stiff they barely worked. She fought the urge to cry. From the corner of her eye, she saw two figures pause on the street. It was Mabel and Coralie, two women known for having gossip sharper than a winter frost. They were whispering behind their shawls, but they weren't trying to be quiet. "Poor ghost widow," one of them said, loud enough for the wind to carry the words right to Isabella's ears. "Too proud to beg for help, too barren to ever wed a man who could." Their laughter was like thorns, drifting across the snow and piercing her. Isabella just bowed her head lower, gathering the logs one by one, feeling as if each piece of wood was another stone they were laying on her shoulders. Then she heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate, crunching through the snow. She lifted her eyes and her breath caught. It was him, the Apache giant. He was standing at the edge of her small yard. His hair was as white as hers, his chest bare again, despite the biting wind, though this time he had a worn blanket draped loosely over his shoulders. He didn't say a word. He just bent down and started gathering the scattered logs. His massive, scarred hands moved with a surprising gentleness that startled her. Across the way, the two women gasped. One of them hissed, "Look at her, letting a savage into her own yard." The other one spat right into the snow. Isabella's cheeks burned with a mix of shame and anger. Her stomach twisted into a knot. But she didn't stop him. She couldn't. Something about the way he handled each log, so precise and careful, felt like a gesture of respect. Maybe it was the only respect she had been shown in years. When all the logs were neatly stacked on her porch, he straightened up. Steam rose from his body in the cold air. For a long moment, their eyes met. She opened her mouth, trying to find the right words, but the sound of the gossipers' cruel laughter from across the street rang out louder than anything she could have said. He saw the look on her face and turned as if to leave, his shoulders slumping with that familiar, heavy shame. "Wait," she whispered. He paused, his back still to her. "Come inside, she said, her voice stronger now. "There's warmth." It was the first invitation she had offered to anyone in months. She knew what it meant. She knew the town, the gossip, would feast on this for weeks. But for the first time, she didn't care. Her voice didn't falter. The inside of the cabin was dim, glowing faintly from the fire in the hearth. Isabella ladled some beans from a small pot into a tin bowl, placed a piece of cornbread beside it, and set it on the small table in front of him. He sat down stiffly, looking at the simple meal, as if he was completely unaccustomed to such an offering. His hand hovered over the food for a long moment before he finally picked up the spoon. He ate slowly, each bite deliberate and measured. Isabella sat across from him, watching the firelight dance across the ridges of the scars that crisscrossed his chest and arms, like ancient rivers carved into stone. They weren't ugly to her, not at all. They were proof, proof of a life that had been lived, a life that had survived. He noticed her looking at him and shifted uneasily in his chair, lowering his eyes to his bowl. The silence between them was heavy, but it wasn't an empty silence. It was filled with unspoken things. Two lives that had been worn down by rejection, two bodies that carried the visible and invisible marks of shame, two souls that had been denied even the simplest kindness for far too long. Finally, he set his spoon down. When he spoke, his voice was rough, like stone grinding against steel. "You should not let me stay. They will speak of this." She folded her hands in her lap, her knuckles pressing white against her skin. "They already speak," she answered softly. "Let them." His gaze flickered up to meet hers then, a flash of surprise in his dark eyes. It was as if he had expected her to be afraid, to recoil from the consequences, but instead she just sat there, steady and calm, her silver hair unbound, her eyes holding his without a trace of fear. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she felt no need to hide. The storm got worse as dusk fell. The wind shrieked and howled, and the snow hammered against the roof like 1,000 tiny fists. When Isabella reached across the table to take his empty bowl, her fingers brushed against his. The contact was a jolt, small but startling, like touching a flame after being cold for so long. She pulled her hand back quickly, her cheeks flushing, but her eyes lingered on his hands. They were wide and covered in scars, but they were steady. He stood up, as if he intended to leave and face the storm. But the wind roared so fiercely just then that the cabin door shook violently in its frame. She took a deep breath. "Stay," she said. "The road will take you." He hesitated, a clear conflict in his eyes. The battle between his deep-seated shame and the basic need for survival. After a long moment, he gave a single, sharp nod. That night, he sat on the floor near the hearth while she mended a tear in his old buckskin shirt. Her fingers moved carefully, the needle and thread weaving through the worn fabric with a quiet focus. With each pass of the needle, it felt to her like she wasn't just mending cloth. It felt like she was mending a tiny broken fragment of something inside both of them. He watched her hands, the way a few silver strands of her hair fell across her cheek in the firelight. He wanted to speak, to thank her for the food, for the warmth, for the mending. But the words were caught in his throat like shards of ice. So instead, he got up and placed another log on the fire. The flames leaped higher, and the shadows danced and flickered across their faces. In that shifting, uncertain light, they didn't look like two outcasts, worn down by age and loneliness. They looked like two souls that were still burning. The hours stretched on, the fury of the storm a constant, rhythmic beating against the walls of their small shelter. At one point, Isabella got up to secure a rattling shutter. The sight of her standing there outlined by the firelight, her silver hair shining, her eyes resolute, struck him with a force that surprised him. He had thought no woman would ever look at him again without seeing a monster, without feeling contempt or fear. But she did. When she came back to her chair, she didn't say anything. She just picked up his shirt and resumed her stitching. The silence between them felt alive now, carrying a warmth all its own. Outside, the town was already talking. Mabel and Coralie had wasted no time. They had carried the tale straight to the tavern. The ghost widow Isabella had taken the Apache savage into her house, fed him, and now she was keeping him there through the night. Men muttered darkly over their mugs of whiskey. Women whispered on the church steps the next morning, their faces grim with judgment. The town's verdict was like a snowdrift, piling higher and higher with each retelling of the story. But inside the cabin, neither Isabella nor the Apache spoke of it. They were too focused on this small, fragile grace, the simple act of sharing warmth while the world howled outside their door. When the fire finally burned low, Isabella folded the mended shirt and placed it on the floor beside him. Their eyes met again. She wanted to say thank you for the wood, for staying, for not letting her feel so completely alone. But her voice broke before she could form the words. Instead, she just nodded. He inclined his head in return, as if he understood everything she couldn't say. He stretched out on the floor near the hearth, pulling the worn blanket over him. She lay down in her own narrow bed, facing the dying firelight. Sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the cabin's timber, every gust of wind against the shutters, was a reminder of the storm outside and the other storm, the one made of whispers and judgment, that was brewing in the town. But the sound of his steady breathing from the floor near her hearth calmed her racing heart. Before she finally drifted off, her lips moved, forming a whisper that no one else could possibly hear. "I've waited my whole life for someone who would stay." The words hung in the air, fragile but fierce. And though he didn't stir, she had the strangest feeling that the rhythm of his breathing had shifted, just for a moment. As if he too had heard her and had carried the weight of that same longing with him into the storm of his own dreams. The days that followed fell into a strange, new rhythm, a pattern of silence and small, unspoken gestures. The snow kept coming, pressing down on the world, making the air so brittle it felt like it could shatter. But inside Isabella's cabin, a fragile, tentative warmth was beginning to take root. Every morning when she opened her door, she found a stack of firewood piled high, much more than she had chopped the day before. And every evening when she placed a bowl of food on the table, the silent man across from her would bow his head for a moment before he ate, though no prayer ever passed his lips. His constant presence was unsettling to her at first, not because she feared him, but because of the ache it stirred deep within her. It was the ache of being truly seen after having been invisible for so long. One night, as the fire burned low and cast long shadows on the walls, he spoke more than a single sentence for the first time. His voice was low, a gravelly rumble that had been worn smooth by years of disuse. "You should know," he said, his eyes fixed on the flickering flames. "I was once not a man people could welcome." His hand moved, brushing absently across the thick scars on his chest, as if the memories lived in the raised lines of his skin. "I rode with warriors. We fought. We burned. We took what we wanted. And when the wars were over, there was no place left for men like me. My own people saw me as a shadow of old blood, a reminder of a time they wanted to forget. The whites, they saw me only as an enemy." He paused, the silence stretching. "So I walked away from both. Alone." He fell quiet again, his broad shoulders stiffening, as if he were bracing himself for her to recoil in disgust. Isabella's hands folded in her lap, trembled slightly, but it wasn't from fear. She watched the profile of his face in the firelight, the strong line of his nose, the way the white hair framed eyes that were shadowed with a lifetime of regret. "And now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. A bitter, humorless smile touched his lips. "Now I cut wood for a woman who offers me bread. It is better than war." The raw humility in his words hit her with an unexpected force, filling her with a strange, painful tenderness. She wanted to tell him that he deserved more than just scraps of peace thrown his way. But shame, her old familiar companion, pressed the words back down into her chest. She too carried a story of rejection, and speaking it aloud felt like tearing open a wound that had never properly healed. It was 2 nights later when her own voice finally broke through the wall of her silence. The snow had started again, rattling like tiny pebbles against the windowpane. She was sitting by the lantern, sewing, her silver hair glowing in the soft light. Without lifting her eyes from her work, she began to speak, her voice a low whisper. "I was married once. I was younger than I should have been. He wanted sons to carry on his name." Her fingers stilled. "I could not give him any. The doctor said my body was closed, like winter soil. He called me barren. His family called me cursed." Her voice faltered for a moment, but she forced herself to go on. "When he died, they pushed me out of the house like a piece of unwanted rubbish. Since then, since then, I have lived as though I am only half a person, too old for love, too useless for work, too strange for company. That is what they say about me." Her throat tightened with unshed tears, but she made herself look up, daring to meet his gaze across the small room. "Do you see now? Do you see why I understand your silence?" For a long, heavy moment, he said nothing. Then slowly, he leaned forward, his scarred hand coming to rest on the edge of the table. He didn't touch her, but his nearness had a weight to it, a presence that was both grounding and electric. "You are not useless," he said, his voice simple and direct. "You are fire in a storm. That is enough." Her breath caught in her throat. The words struck her with more force than any physical blow. No man had spoken to her with anything but scorn or pity for years. She had to turn her face away, hiding the sudden sting of tears in her eyes. And for the first time in a decade, she felt a little less alone in the world. But outside their small, warm refuge, the world had not grown any kinder. The gossip in the town was spreading faster than snowmelt in the spring. Mabel and Coralie were spinning wild tales now, that Isabella had given herself to a savage, that she was no better than a heathen, that her unnatural silver hair was a mark of the devil. The whispers eventually reached the ears of Sheriff Arlen Tate. He was a decent man, and he tried to warn her kindly. He came by the cabin one afternoon, his face etched with worry. "The town won't forgive much, Isabella," he said, his eyes avoiding the stack of freshly cut wood by her door. "You're already on the edge of things with them. Don't give them a reason to shove you off completely." His gaze darted toward the woods where he had likely seen the Apache's silhouette among the trees. "That man, he brings trouble." Isabella just tightened her shawl around her shoulders and gave him no answer. To defend the man would only prove their suspicions right. But it wasn't just gossip that was threatening her fragile peace. One evening, as the twilight bruised the snowfield purple and gray, a figure on horseback appeared at her gate. It was Silas Boone, a wealthy rancher whose land bordered her own. He dismounted with the slow, deliberate arrogance of a man who believed every acre he could see rightfully belonged to him. His coat was made of fine wool, his boots were polished to a high shine, but his smile was as jagged and ugly as a piece of broken glass. "Evening, Isabella," he drawled, his eyes raking over her small cabin. "Mighty cold for a lady to be keeping house all by herself. Seems a shame to waste a place like this when a man like me could put it to much better use." His eyes slid toward the cabin window, where the firelight flickered warmly. "Of course, I hear you've already found yourself some company," he smirked. "Big fella, ain't he? A savage, I hear." Isabella's blood ran cold, and it had nothing to do with the wind. She stepped out onto the porch, her spine as stiff and straight as a fence post. "Whatever you've heard, Mr. Boone, this is my home, and it will remain my home." Boone's ugly smile widened. "For now, maybe. But a woman alone can't hold on to land when the wolves come sniffing around. Sell it to me, and I'll see to it you're fed through the winter. Refuse? Well, storms take lives every year out here. Folks won't blame me if this one happens to take yours." He tipped his hat in a mocking gesture and swung himself back up into the saddle. "Think on it, Ghost Widow. The snow can bury a lot more than just wood." His horse clattered away, its hooves striking sparks against the frozen ground. Inside the cabin, Isabella recounted Boone's words, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and rage. The Apache listened, his eyes burning with a restrained fury. "He threatens you because he thinks you have no shield," he said, his voice as taut as a drawn bowstring. She met his intense gaze, her own voice trembling but resolute. Then let him think wrong. For the first time, she saw the deep shame in his eyes harden into something else, something fierce, protective, loyalty. He rose to his full height, towering in the small room, and laid another log on the fire with a sense of finality. "If he comes," he said, his voice a low growl, "he will not take what is yours." That night, the storm carried more than just snow. A loud crash split the darkness, jolting them both from a restless sleep. Isabella and the Apache, she had learned his name was Chenoa, rushed out into the freezing cold, the lantern light swinging wildly in her hand. Her barn door was smashed open, hanging crookedly from one hinge. Splinters of wood were scattered across the snowdrifts, and carved deep into the wood, a crude warning, a knife mark in the shape of an X. Boone's men had left their message. Her mule stamped nervously inside the barn, its breath steaming in the cold air, its eyes wide with fear. Isabella clutched the lantern, its flame quivering in the wind, and she felt a knot of fear tighten in her chest. But beside her stood the giant with the white hair, his scars standing out starkly in the flickering lantern light. He looked at the mark on the door, then he looked at her, and his jaw set like a block of stone. The storm raged around them, but in that moment Isabella felt another kind of storm rising, a storm of judgment, of threats, and of a violence that was looming just over the horizon. And though her heart trembled, a new defiant thought flickered to life inside her. Perhaps shame wasn't the end of their story. Perhaps it was the beginning of something much, much fiercer. The lantern light swayed, cutting shadows across Chenoa's face. In the howling silence, he spoke four words that both chilled her to the bone and steadied her resolve all at once. "They will come again." The morning came pale and brittle, the sky a flat, heavy gray, pregnant with snow that had yet to fall. Isabella stepped outside to fetch water from the well, her shawl pulled tight around her, and she immediately saw them. Neighbors, watching her from the road. Their faces held the same familiar look of disdain she had grown used to, but now it was sharpened with something new. Accusation. "There she is," one woman muttered, her voice carrying on the still cold air. "Playing house with a savage." Another one added, "Her poor dead husband must be turning in his grave." Isabella lowered her eyes, heat flooding her cheeks despite the freezing temperature. The weight of their judgment felt like a physical thing, pressing down on her. But underneath the shame, a strange, hard resolve was beginning to form. A kind of steel was rising in her spine. She was tired of it, so incredibly tired of shrinking beneath words that cut her deeper than any knife ever could. Inside, Chenoa was splitting wood in silence. Every single strike of the axe against the log rang out like a hammer blow of judgment. His jaw was clenched, his breath coming in steady rhythmic clouds. but he wouldn't look at her. His eyes avoided hers completely. When he finally spoke, his voice was edged with a deep, sorrowful guilt. "They hate me," he said, his back still to her. "And because of me, they will turn on you completely. You will lose this place." She set the heavy water bucket down, her hands trembling from the cold and the emotional strain. "I have been losing pieces of myself for years," she whispered to his back. "But it has not been because of you." He turned then, his dark eyes haunted and full of pain. "You deserve peace, not this ruin that I have brought to your door." She took a step closer to him, a lock of her silver hair falling across her cheek. Her own voice hardened with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "Peace without dignity is no peace at all, Chenoa." That night Boone returned, and this time he brought his men. They stood in the road just beyond her gate, their torches flickering and spitting in the falling snow. Their laughter was loud and cruel, designed to wake every shuttered house in the town, to make sure everyone was a witness. Isabella and Chenoa watched them from the porch, the single lantern she held casting a thin, fragile circle of light around them. Boone's voice cut through the wind. "You've made your choice, Isabella. You let the old savage stay in your house, and now you'll pay the price for it. That land was never meant for a barren old woman like you. I'll see you frozen in the ground before I let you keep it." He spat into the snow and raised his torch high, as if he were about to set her fence on fire. Chenoa stepped forward. He moved to the edge of the porch, bare-chested against the storm, his white hair streaming in the wind. The torchlight painted his scars in shimmering shades of copper and shadow. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, massive and silent and immovable, until even Boone's loudmouthed men began to shift uneasily in their saddles. Then his voice thundered out, a low rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself, a sound that vibrated underneath the howl of the wind. "You will not touch her land," Boone sneered, but his eyes flickered with a hint of uncertainty. "She hides behind you, old man. What will she do when you're gone?" For a single terrifying heartbeat, Isabella's fear surged. But then she felt something inside of her crack wide open, like river ice in a spring thaw. She stepped down from the porch onto the snow right beside Chenoa. Her shawl fell loose from her shoulders, and her silver hair glimmered and shone in the wild torchlight. The gossips had always claimed she was cursed, that she was unnatural. Fine. Let them see the truth of it. She placed her hand flat against his scarred chest, and she could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart beneath her palm. Her voice trembled, but it was fierce. "I will not hide," she said, her voice rising to be heard over the storm. "Not from you, not from any of them. I have waited my whole life for someone who would stand with me, and I will stand with him." The words struck the men harder than any physical blow could have. Even Boone faltered, his ugly smirk thinning into a tight line. He was stunned. He had expected her to cower, to weep, to beg. He had not expected this. He gave a frustrated gesture, and his men, seeming to have lost their nerve, hurled their torches into the snowdrifts, where they hissed and sputtered out. "This isn't over," Boone hissed, his voice full of venom as he began to retreat into the darkness. Their laughter faded with the sound of their hoofbeats, leaving only the sound of the storm behind. Isabella's hand lingered on Chenoa's chest for a moment longer before she finally drew it back, her own heart hammering against her ribs. He was looking at her as though he had just witnessed a fire being reborn. Not in the hearth, but in her eyes. The days that followed were worse. The town's judgment, now that she had openly defied them, grew crueler. Children, emboldened by their parents' hatred, threw snowballs at her door, shouting the names they had heard whispered. "Witch! Savage lover!" The women of the town would physically cross the street to avoid her, muttering prayers under their breath as if to ward off a plague. Even Sheriff Tate, who seemed to have a sliver of sympathy, urged her to be cautious. "Boone has powerful friends, Isabella," he warned her quietly one day. "Friends in high places. If he decides to press this with the law, claiming that land, you won't stand a chance." Isabella listened, her spine seeming to grow straighter with each word he spoke. "Then let him press," she answered, her voice quiet but firm. "I am done living my life bent over in shame." Tate studied her face for a long moment, surprised by the iron resolve in her voice, and then he simply nodded and walked away. Inside the cabin, the storm of silence between her and Chenoa had thickened again. He sat by the fire, sharpening his knife, the scrape of stone on steel filling the small room. His movements were heavy with a guilt that was almost palpable. "You should send me away," he said finally, his eyes still on the blade. "I bring you nothing but scorn. They will see to it that you starve if I stay." Isabella put down her sewing, her voice as steady as the hand that held the needle, though her heart ached. "If you go," she said, "the scorn will remain. Only the warmth will be gone." He looked at her then. He truly looked at her, and something in his guarded expression seemed to break. "But still," he whispered, his voice almost a plea, "we are too old for love." She leaned closer, her hand gently brushing against his scarred knuckles. "No," she answered softly, "we are old enough to know its worth." Her words seemed to forge a new, unspoken bond between them. But their trials were far from over. Boone struck again. This time he didn't just threaten. Under the cover of darkness, he and his men set fire to the huge pile of wood that Chenoa had painstakingly chopped and stacked outside her cabin. The wood that was meant to see them through the rest of the brutal winter. Flames roared against the night sky, sparks scattering like a swarm of angry orange stars. Isabella and Chenoa rushed outside, the intense heat searing their faces. Across the road and from the windows of nearby houses, neighbors watched. They just watched. None of them dared to help. Boone's cruel laughter echoed in the darkness as he and his men rode away, leaving a pillar of destruction in their wake. Isabella fell to her knees in the snow, the heat of the loss scorching her chest, tears finally streaming down her face. Chenoa crouched beside her, his large hand coming to rest on her shoulder. His voice was fierce, a low growl of pure protective rage. "He will not break you," he said, "not while I still breathe." She looked up into his eyes and saw no shame, no regret. She saw a shield that had been forged in the fires of loyalty. Together they worked through the rest of the night, using shovels and wet blankets to salvage what little wood they could from the fire. Their hands were blistered, their breath was ragged, their faces were smeared with ash. At dawn, a new pile of wood stood in the yard. It was much smaller, but it was there. It was more than just a supply of fuel now. It was a symbol of their defiance. Isabella brushed the ash from her silver hair, her body trembling with exhaustion. But when she turned and looked at the watching neighbors, who were now peering from their doorways, she did not bow her head. Instead, she lifted her chin, her dignity shining brighter than the freshly fallen snow. That evening, as they sat by the hearth, a new kind of silence stretched between them. It felt like a bridge that had just been built, strong and steady. Isabella reached out and laid her hand gently over his. The firelight warmed their joined skin. Neither of them spoke, but in that quiet, simple gesture, there was a vow. Whatever came next, they would not face it apart. The storm outside raged, rattling the shutters and shaking the small cabin, but inside they held fast. The next night brought no rest. A loud, frantic knock pounded at the door, hard enough to shake the entire frame. Isabella's heart stopped. Chenoa rose silently, his newly sharpened knife in his hand. He opened the door to reveal a boy, no more than 12 years old, breathless and wide-eyed with terror. "Boone's coming," the boy stammered, his words tumbling out in a rush. "He's coming with rifles. He told my pa he means to take it all tonight." The child turned and fled into the swirling snow, leaving his terrifying words hanging like smoke in the room. Isabella clutched the edge of the table, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. Chenoa closed the door slowly, his expression completely unreadable. Then he turned to face her, his voice as steady and hard as stone. "At dawn," he said, "it ends." The storm broke just before dawn, the wind screaming across the valley, flinging snow sideways in blinding white sheets. Isabella awoke not to the light, but to the sound. The crunch of many boots in the snow outside, and the low, angry murmur of voices carried on the wind. She rose from her bed, pulling her shawl tightly around her, and saw Chenoa standing at the window. His broad back was lit by the deep orange glow of the hearth fire. His hair, as white as the blizzard outside, caught the light like spun silver wire. He turned to face her. The scars on his chest were stark, dark lines against his skin. In his eyes, she saw no trace of fear, only the heavy, somber calm of a man who has faced death so many times that he no longer trembles before it. "They are here," he said, his voice a steady, low rumble. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a painful, frantic rhythm. But when she stepped closer to him, she was surprised to find that her own voice did not falter. "Then we will meet them." She tied her shawl tighter, a useless gesture against the cold that was coming, a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. His hand brushed against hers, the lightest of touches, but in that brief contact, she felt a warmth that was stronger than any fire. Together, they stepped outside. The world was a chaotic blur of white and orange. Torches burned and sputtered in the storm, held by men mounted on restless, stamping horses. Their rifles gleamed dark and menacing in the flickering light. And at the center of them all sat Silas Boone, tall in his saddle, his grin a jagged, ugly scar in the cold morning air. "There she is," he called out, his voice cutting through the howl of the wind and snow. "The ghost widow and her pet savage. Step aside, Isabella. This land is mine now." Isabella could feel the eyes of the entire town on her. She saw faces peering from behind shuttered windows, dark shapes lingering in doorways where the whispers had always flourished. The weight of their collective shame pressed down on her, urging her to bow her head, to give in, to simply disappear as they had always wanted her to. But something inside her, that new, hard steel, refused to bend. She walked down the porch steps, her boots sinking into the deep snow, until she was standing right at Chenoa's side. The torchlight painted her silver hair with fire, and though her breath came fast and hard, her voice carried, clear and strong. "This is my home," she said. "You will not take it." Boone let out a harsh, ugly laugh. "Your home? You were never meant to hold land, you barren old witch. You were meant to wither up and die alone. And you," his sneer cut toward Chenoa, "you should have died in the wars with the rest of your kind. Too old, too broken to fight anymore. Look at you, white hair, scars. There's nothing left of you but a shadow." The insults were meant to cut deep, but Chenoa didn't even flinch. He took a step forward, his bare feet crushing the fresh snow, his massive form towering in the torchlight. His voice rolled out low and heavy, thick with a restrained fury that was more terrifying than any shout. "I have buried more men than you have ever faced in your life. If you cross this line, Boone, you will join them." The silence that followed was as sharp and sudden as a knife's edge. Even Boone's hired men shifted nervously in their saddles, their bravado shrinking under the giant's unblinking gaze. Boone barked a short, nervous laugh, trying to cover his fear. He raised his rifle, the torchlight glinting off the polished steel. "Then let's see if the old savage still has teeth." The world contracted to a single, held breath. The snow whipped wildly around them. Isabella's heart pounded like a war drum. Boone leveled the gun, aiming it straight at Chenoa's bare chest. But before he could pull the trigger, Chenoa moved. It was a sudden, shocking explosion of speed and ferocity. He lunged forward, his scarred hand gripping the rifle's barrel, wrenching it violently upward just as the shot cracked through the storm. Sparks and flame burst into the night sky, and the rifle went flying, clattering into a snowdrift. In the very same motion, Chenoa's other hand swung around, his fist connecting with Boone's jaw with a sickening crunch. The rancher was thrown from his horse, sprawling backward into the deep snow. Gasps rippled through the watching crowd of townspeople. Boone scrambled to his feet, his face twisted with pure, murderous rage. But before he could draw the long knife from the sheath at his belt, Chenoa's boot was planted firmly on his chest, pinning him to the ground. The giant's breath steamed in heavy white clouds, his eyes burning like dark coals. "You are nothing," he said, his voice thunderous yet strangely calm. "You prey on the weak because you are afraid of the strong. This land is hers. If you ever touch it again, I will end you." Boone's men hesitated, their eyes wide, shifting uneasily. Not one of them moved to help their employer. The storm howled louder, filling the silence between heartbeats. At last, Boone spat a mouthful of blood into the snow and tried to shove the boot off his chest, but Chenoa didn't yield an inch. It was then that Isabella stepped forward. Her shawl whipped in the wind around her, her voice steady and powerful, though her chest heaved with emotion. "Listen well," she said, her voice ringing out, facing the torches, the rifles, and the watching, silent town. "I have lived for 40 winters with my head bowed beneath shame. I have been cast aside, called cursed, called barren, called a ghost. Tonight I will bow no more. I would rather freeze to death in these drifts than give one single inch of my dignity to a man who seeks to steal it." Her words rang through the storm, carrying a power that silence and whispers could not contain. The neighbors who had once scorned her fell completely hushed, their faces pale and uncertain in the torchlight. Even Boone's own men lowered their rifles, suddenly unwilling to raise their weapons against such raw, defiant courage. Boone himself squirmed in the snow, humiliated and powerless beneath Chenoa's weight. Finally, he snarled and spat again. "This isn't the end!" Chenoa leaned down close, his white hair falling across his face, his voice low but as sharp and cold as ice. "For you, Boone, it is." He stepped back, allowing the rancher to rise. Boone staggered to his feet, his eyes burning with impotent rage. But no ally moved to his side. One by one, his men began to turn their horses, their torches guttering out as they disappeared back into the snow and the darkness. Boone cursed them, stumbled after them, and vanished into the storm's white shroud. A heavy silence fell. Only the wind remained, rattling the shutters of the houses, stirring the fresh drifts of snow. Isabella stood trembling, not from fear anymore, but from the release of it. Her hand rose, brushing the snow from her hair, but her eyes remained fixed on Chenoa. He turned toward her, the scars on his body etched deep by the lingering torchlight, his chest heaving with the aftermath of a battle that had been fought not with blades but with resolve. The onlookers from the town lingered for a moment, their faces uncertain, but none of them spoke. At last, Sheriff Tate stepped forward from the crowd, his expression solemn. "Boone's claim on this land is void," he declared, his voice loud enough for every watching doorway and window to hear. "This land is yours, Isabella. No one will contest it again." His words carried through the morning air, silencing the town's gossip like the final tolling of a bell. When the crowd finally thinned, when only the sound of the dying storm remained, Isabella turned to the giant who stood beside her. Snow clung to his white hair, and his scars shone dark against his pale skin. For a moment, that old, familiar shame flickered in his eyes, as though he still believed himself to be too old, too broken. She stepped closer to him, her own voice breaking, as tender and warm as firelight. "You said we are too old for love," she whispered, "but I say we are old enough to know its worth." He stood as still as if he were carved from stone. Then slowly he lowered his head. Her hand rose, coming to rest against his chest, right over the place where his heart was thundering. The whole world seemed to narrow to the warmth of his skin beneath her fingers. The snow was falling softer now, and the silence was no longer empty. His hand came up to rest over hers, scarred and heavy, but impossibly gentle. In the glow of the firelight coming from her cabin, in the hush of the falling snow, they stood together as two souls who had carried the crushing weight of shame for far too long. Now they were bound by something new, a dignity that they had reclaimed together. When his voice finally came, it was quiet, almost reverent. "I have walked many winters alone," he said. "I did not believe there was anyone left who could see me as more than a ghost." She lifted her face to his, her silver hair clinging to her cheeks, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "And I did not believe there was anyone left who would stay." They drew together then, the storm swirling softly around them, the town hidden and silent behind its shuttered windows. The fire of their joined hearts was burning brighter than all the torches that had come to extinguish them. For the first time in more winters than she could count, Isabella felt the weight of shame lift from her shoulders. It was replaced by something fierce, enduring, and wonderfully, breathtakingly alive. Later, when they stepped back inside the cabin, the fire crackled warmly, casting a gentle light upon the walls. Isabella sank into her chair by the hearth, her shawl slipping from her shoulders, and she watched as Chenoa lowered himself to the floor. His scars no longer seemed like marks of ruin, but like testaments of survival. His white hair no longer seemed like a curse, but like a crown. She whispered, almost to herself, "I have waited my whole life for you." And in that quiet room, as the snow sealed the world outside, you have to wonder. Perhaps love doesn't always bloom in the spring of our youth, or in the bright, hot blaze of summer. Perhaps sometimes it waits. It waits until the winters have taught us patience, until rejection has carved us out and made us hollow enough to finally be filled. Perhaps no heart is ever truly too old for love's fire, if it just dares to burn against the storm. If you believe a story of courage and justice like this one deserves to be told, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join us for more.